cinsiyet eşitliği konferansımıza dini yorumlar, ritüeller.
On freedom of religion or belief and gender equality in Turkey, we're going to be talking about religious interpretations, rituals, and women's agency. So the moderator for this section is going to be Professor Bedriye Poyraz. I'm sure that people know Professor Poyraz, but just to give you some brief information, Bedriye Poyraz is a full professor of media studies at Ankara University, Faculty of Communication. She received her MA and PhD degrees from the same faculty. Currently, she lectures and researches on media studies, gender discrimination, and related issues. She also lectures and researches on memory studies in the context of human rights and societal confrontation in Turkey. Her main interest has been the Alevi community's cultural identity and faith. She also explores gender issues in the context of Alevi belief. She has written numerous academic articles and books. So we have allocated 90 minutes for this session, 20 minutes for the presentations, 5 minutes for your comments, and for 15 minutes for questions and answers. Just a brief note for the audience. We have Turkish and English interpretation, which you can listen to by the buttons underneath your Zoom screen. Thank you very much for your kind invitation. It is an honor for me to be here. I believe that this is a very important issue, and I've been working on gender in the context of Alevism, and I believe therefore how important this issue is. Generally, when we talk about gender issues, probably the hardest wall that we have in front of us is probably faith. Especially for groups that could be considered minorities or different groups like the Alevi community. Although they are aware of the discrimination that they are facing as a community, they are not that successful in identifying the discrimination that they have in their own community against women, or they are unwilling to face up to that fact. Therefore, this conference, these kinds of efforts are very important. These discussions are very important. I would like to thank you for organizing this. Now, I would like to give the floor to our first panelist, Nurgül Çelebi, and her presentation is titled Syriac Women in Rituals from Ishtar to the Present. We have 20 minutes for her presentation. The floor is yours. Thank you very much. And I'd like to welcome all of the participants as well. I'm going to be sharing my screen. So briefly, I'm going to talk about Syriacs, and I'm going to talk about the roots of Syriacs as well. The Syriac communities are not very well known in Turkey, and they are a minority. So briefly, I'm going to talk about the roots of Syriacs, and then I'm especially going to talk about the place of Syriac women in religious rituals. Briefly, some of the titles that I'm going to go through. Jana, Ishtar, goddess of war and love. I'm going to start with her because Arcadians, Assyrians, and Babylonians, who are the ancestors of the Syriac community, worshipped to a great extent the goddess of war and love, Jana, Ishtar. And then I'm going to talk about the whores of Ishtar and Jana, or priestesses of Ishtar and Jana, and then I'm going to talk about the temples of Jana, Ishtar, and then I'm going to talk about the place of Syriac women in the religions, in the rituals, and the relation of them with this Ishtar cult. So in Turkey's borders, Harran, Mardin, are especially host to Syriac communities in Turkey. In ancient times, this is the area where the Arkads lived, and then the Assyrians lived, and Babylonians in different tribes. Arameans lived, and all of these civilizations are the ancestors of the Syriacs. And again, geographically, when you look at it, Gaziantep, or some part of it at least, has also been a host to the culture of these communities as well. We have certain archaeological remains that tell us so. So who are these civilizations that we're mentioning? When you look at the historiography, almost all of the Mesopotamian communities are Semitic peoples, and these are the ancestors of Syriacs, as I've mentioned. The first written text comes from the Sumerian period, and obviously there are certain instances of research into prehistoric times as well, before the writing was invented, but especially we get the most information from the written texts for the first time from the Sumerians. And Ishtar, the goddess of war and love, was based on Jana in the Sumerian time, and then in the Akkad time it turned to Ishtar, and later on all the communities that came after, Assyrians, Babylonians, Arameans, and Syriacs, they also worshipped Ishtar. To talk about the Syria population a little bit, their population is dwindling in Turkey. We have at the moment, I mean, the figures that you see on the screen have gone down a little bit more, as a matter of fact, because of the Syrian war. There were migrations, but in when we look at the analyses of the figures at the churches, the figures that we get is that we have about 25,000, 30,000 Syriacs in Turkey. Before the war in Syria, they had about 200,000 to 800,000 Syriacs, but these are not up-to-date numbers because there has been a lot of migration out of Syria because of the war. And again, in Sweden, 150,000, in Iran, 17,000, in Germany, and in other European countries, we have a lot of Syriacs as well. Therefore, they have a strong diaspora. But who are the Syriacs? This is the first community that accepted the confession of Christian faith. Therefore, they were instrumental in creating certain basic tenets of Christianity as well. In order to understand Christianity, therefore, one needs to understand the doctrines or the tenets of the Syriac faith of olden times. And the Syriac women, as I will tell about it, have played a very important role in the religion, and this could also have formed the basis for the inclusion of women in the Protestant or Catholic manifestations of faith as well. So after the Sumerians, there was an Arcadian Empire, and this is the first emperor of Arkad, Sargon. He established this empire in about 2300 BCE, and he played a very important role, therefore, in this geography, in this region. In the Mesopotamian belief systems, all of the empires that covered this territory and the emperors of those empires were like gods as well. When you look at the Mesopotamian communities, they were an agricultural society, and sun, moon, and stars played a very important role. Celestial bodies played a very important role, therefore, in their belief system. All of them are related to agriculture as well. Therefore, they were, in a way, rendering holy the celestial bodies. And the emperors, therefore, were seen as semi-gods as well. And what was the importance of Sargon? Jana, the goddess of war and love, increased in visibility a lot during his reign, because his daughter, Sargon's daughter, Enheduanna, and she's referred to in feminist studies as well, she probably was the first advocate of, she was a priestess, and she was probably the first advocate of feminism. And she was instrumental in the formation of the first rituals at temples. Therefore, in the post-Sargon period, Sargon and his daughter Enheduanna, we see that Ishtar occupied the top spot in the pantheon of gods in this region. So why was Ishtar important? First of all, Ishtar was a woman, and she represented love, a very strong character, but also a warring goddess for love. When you look at these reliefs, you see that her spouse Damuzi dies, and she goes into the netherworld in order to be able to save Damuzi. And she is a goddess that made this great self-sacrifice for her love. Ishtar is a very important figure among the Mesopotamian pantheon of gods. We have gods of the moon and gods of the sun in this pantheon. At one time, Sin, the god of moon, and Shamash, the god of the sun, are raised to the first spot at one point, and complementing them as a goddess figure appears Ishtar. So as the father god, the god of moon Sin is very important, and Sin's twin children are Shamash and Ishtar. Therefore, a very important role is given to a feminine figure, a goddess. And her position in this triple is very important in her being raised to this top spot later on. So this pantheon of gods is a very crowded one, as a matter of fact, but probably the most important god deity here became Ishtar, and after that certain rituals performed, and especially these sacred marriage ceremonies were the most important one of these rituals. Why? Because the deity that we call Jana Ishtar, her spouse Damuzi, is a shepherd god, and for agricultural societies who were hunter-gatherers before, herds were of extreme importance. Therefore, in order not to starve, it was very important that they had a lot of herds and a lot of animals in their herds, and they would pray for that. Therefore, as a shepherd god, Damuzi's power was to render fertile all the crops and all the livestock. And how could he do that? Obviously, more animals, more livestock in the herd, therefore reproduction. Therefore, reproduction, because of the importance of having more animals in the herds, became a very important motive. And the marriage between Damuzi and Ishtar was very important because of that. And these societies turned these ceremonies into a ritual, these marriage ceremonies into a ritual. And while practicing these rituals, in order to render fertile their herds and their crops, each king has had to practice this marriage ceremony once again, therefore unifying with the goddess mother, with the king. Marriage ceremonies were performed, and this was, in a way, benedicting all the herds, a blessing, consecrating all the herds and the crops. When you look at the temple of Vienna, these priestesses, in fact, performed reproduction as a religious ritual. And after a point, they were called halls of this temple, but this, the word hall doesn't really carry the same meaning as we use it today, as a matter of fact. This meant a holy union. So Uruk, the city of Uruk, raised to the first, foremost worshipped Ishtar, and the Temple of the Mother, Temple of Jana, is a very important stop in this city. This city turned into the Temple of Jana because of the popularity of Ishtar later on, and this is called the Heavenly House. And also, there are several other dedicated temples in many other cities like Nippur, Lagash, Shuruppak, and Zabalam, and Ur. So once Jana and Ishtar started to get the first top spot, then we see the formation of a priestess group, and many rituals were being performed in these temples. So this clergy of priestesses, once they were created, obviously the place of women religiously has changed as well. For example, you see here the vase from Uruk, and you see the Ishtar rituals here, and you see the offerings made by men to a goddess in this vase. And there are priests here as well. And sometimes these priests, for example, in the Jana temples, wore women's clothes and participated in the rituals. And this is respect being offered to a feminine figure, a goddess, and it's a very important respect of the faith. When you look at the law of the Code of Hammurabi, around that time, we don't in fact see that women had a lot of rights. However, after this period, with Ishtar, the status of women changes. Another important figure is Adad-Gubbi and the son Nabonidus. Nabonidus is the last king of this period, so the empire collapses, but he still has some religious initiative and commercial initiative. However, his mother Adad-Gubbi is especially important because she was a priestess of Sin that replaced the name Ishtar in the Assyrian and Babylonian times, and she was instrumental in turning her son into a king. So that kind of a priestess playing a very important role in the politics of the country shows us how important clergy had become and how women's role had become so important. Adad-Gubbi, therefore, is very important in that respect. And in Aramean, she is called Hadad-Gubbi, and because of that, we can understand that she comes from the Aramean descent as well, which means that Syriac community also finds their basis in the Aramean communities as well. I'd like to mention the Syriac women in the rituals as well. So as I said, this was the first community that accepted the Christian faith. In Antioch, there were Syriac communities, and they had a lot of dialogue with the Christian communities. And probably this Syriac community played a very important role in creating the basic tenets of Christianity. So especially in 4th BCE, the Syriac women started to play a more important role in the religious rituals. And the reason for that is Mor Efrem, one of the most important saints in Christian faith, because we see that he was impressed by the priestesses, and he believed that the Syriac women should be a part of the rituals as well, and a clergy class made up of priestesses should be created as well. And we see after him that the number of Syriac priestesses increase. We see, first of all, the first Syriac Christian priestess as Februnia, who died in 304 BCE, AD. And we see for the first time the creation of a clergy class made up of women in the Syriac Christians. And although they were not part of the rituals at first, we see that they started to go into the choirs later on. So in women choirs, the priestesses are not there, but virgin women at the age of 15 are part of the choirs. Therefore, with Ishtar and Jana, we see that the role of women changes in faith. We see that women are starting to play a role in the rituals, for example, in participating in the choirs, and therefore plays an important role in religion. And we also see that because of these characteristics, the Mesopotamian communities had an impact on Christianity as well, and the transition to Christianity happened through Syriac women, and through the Syriac women in that community, the role of women in religion has become more visible as well. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much indeed. I hope I didn't rush you into your speech. Working on the Syriac community is indeed very important because we always miss working on the Syriac community, and your paper has particularly focused on the Syriac women, particularly on priestesses, and how we should adopt a feminist approach while studying priestesses. However, when we study priestesses or goddesses, it is possible to always adopt an anthropological perspective. Then we can easily talk about those. As far as I understand, your research is based on secondary resources. However, you have also shared with us some very important historical tablets. However, if we look into all those issues from a feminist lens, I think we can also talk about different things. For instance, Fatma Gül Berkay, her PhD research is also very telling, very guiding. And Cemal Bali, likewise, and his study about the politics too. So here is what I want to say. Feminism is a modern phenomenon. And if we look into the past, through this modern concept, it is indeed a difficult exercise, but it is an easy exercise at the same time, because there are multiple gods and goddesses, and indeed you have male and female gods and goddesses, and with the adoption of a single god, God becomes male. But what about the status of women? What about the role of priestesses? Yes, priestesses take part in the church, they take part in the choir. Yet, what about their role in decision-making? Do they have any say? Can they intervene in decision-making processes? So in order for us to respond to these questions, we need a feminist approach, and we need more studies using a feminism lens. And I would like to also offer you another suggestion, if I may. Studying different historical eras may be difficult sometimes, or may be problematic, because sometimes we make some conclusions or draw some conclusions about today based on the data or information we have from the past. So framing the exact research area will be very important. So I would like to thank you very much for your paper. It was very extensive. Thank you very much, Professor. Perhaps I can come in again with a very brief input. There are many studies undertaken right now, particularly at my university, but of course we're talking about a history spanning over 6,000 years. So there should be certain limits and limitations. So I fully agree with what you have suggested. And we see through our studies that the role of women is differentiated. And based on our understanding of the Code of Hammurabi, women is second rate, almost like a slave. But does this change with the priestesses? We need to find this out, because they have an influence over the kings through their sons. That's why we can assess them much better through a feminism lens. Of course, we can always adopt a different approach. However, now that we're talking about women and about this platform, a feminist literature will be very important for us to properly assess this historical era. Let me now invite our second speaker for her paper, Ruveyda Çınar. Her paper is entitled Norm Formation from a Masculine Perspective in Islamic Law and Gendered Fiqh. Over to you. Thank you very much, Professor. Let me share my screen right away. I believe you can see my screen right now. Norm formation. You have 20 minutes, by the way. Thank you. Thank you. Norm formation. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Okay, so norm formation from a masculine perspective in Islamic law and gendered fiqh. This is the title of my paper. I have a background in theology, and I have been through all the difficulties in that journey, as mentioned before. So I would like to first of all share my very purpose about this study, because I have certain concerns or reservations. And right from the beginning, I paid attention to the language that I've been using. So I want to talk about the very purpose of my study, and then I would like to touch upon the Islamic countries, how close they are to the ideal Islamic values or Islamic law. I would like to also talk about the cultural codes in the Islamic law and gender. This will be followed by the relationship between language, culture, and law. And in this context, the normative Arab Islam fiqh, and I will be concluding while mentioning some other important issues. So my very purpose with this paper is not to criticize the holy or sacred items or resources of religion. However, I would like to offer a new lens to the patriarchal historiography, and also a patriarchal religious authorities or institutions. In fact, we always talk about conforming to the society and how we are exposed to that. If we do not conform, we may be excluded. So everything, in fact, originates from this very need So there are certain countries which call themselves Islamic republics, such as Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Sudan. Every now and then, we hear news about women living in these countries. We cannot, of course, assert that secular law systems are always pro-women. However, despite their patriarchal arrangements, they have place for women, and this is very important. In 2010, as part of a research conducted by academics at George Washington University, how Islamic are Islamic countries is the title of the research. This is indeed an economic index, but at the same time, it also measures the extent to which Islamic countries abide by rules of Islam. And according to this Islamicity index, among 37 countries that top the Islamicity index, we cannot find any Islamic countries. Instead, we can see New Zealand, Luxembourg, Ireland, and the Islamic countries only come later down the list. So even though this is an economy index, it also measures the extent of Islam and how it is observed in the context of economy, finance, politics, and how it shapes up the society. So all these measures are initially taken from the Quran and from the life of the Prophet Muhammad. However, they also use certain values that were considered as ideal values by the followers of the religion. In other words, even though all Islamic countries assert that in practice they strictly abide by the principles of fiqh, indeed they have started using Sharia law as an instrument for hegemony. So this is what the index tells us. So religion and religious discourses are used as instruments for masculine hegemony. Let me give you a few examples. A woman who gave birth to a baby out of wedlock in Nigeria was stoned to death. And another example is from Saudi Arabia, where 15 girls were burned alive, and the police did not prevent the situation because they were not wearing headscarf. So these are a few examples that I want to share with you. Now I would like to also talk about the relationship between language, culture, and law. The community that we live in and the language that we use has a direct relationship. I would like to particularly mention the dual nature of the Arabic language, or the binary nature of the Arabic language, because the Islamic law has been shaped up by the Arabic language and Arabic scripture. While identifying the cultural codes of the Islamic fiqh, we can see that the language has some binary or dual concepts. We either see masculine or feminine structures in the language register. For instance, a male slave. Indeed, the sex of the slave is male, it's a man, but on the other hand, they use this letter that I'm highlighting right now, and due to the class due to the low class or low rate of the slave, even the male slave is mentioned with a feminine grammar structure. It is marked by a feminine grammar structure. And that goes beyond the language and also the legal system. Even in the Orthodox discourse, everything is based on obedience, the hierarchy of obedience. Here on this pyramid, you will see at the very bottom, you have those who have to be subservient. Those are the slaves and concubines. Then comes women. Then comes male believers. Then comes leaders of the state, statesmen, and then comes the God. So, in every layer, the ones below have to obey their superiors, and they are responsible to their superiors. For instance, male believer is to be accountable both to the God and to the statesman in respect of the slaves and women. Now I would like to also talk about the masculine norms constructed around women and women's body in Islamic law. And of course, I would like to also talk about how male dominance is legitimized. By the way, these are not straightforward terms with clear-cut meanings. But there are certain norms. First of all, the body of the woman is considered secondary or even dirty. Secondly, women's sexuality is considered as an element of social anarchy. And the third norm is that women's body and sexuality is subject to a legitimate masculine supervision, so to speak. And there are different apparatus and means to do that. For instance, the law on veils. So this is one of the areas where male intervene to curb women's visibility in the public sphere. And then there are some other areas of intervention that talk about the matrimonial disobedience on the part of women. So there is also this stigmatization of dirtiness that holds women from practicing her religion or faith during her menstruation or confinement period. Because women are considered dirty during these periods, and therefore they cannot practice their religious duties, they cannot take part in the religious rituals and services. So this poses an obstacle. And this also causes a physiological determination that goes to say that women are short of reason and faith, so they are deficient in terms of their minds and in terms of their faith. Well, I would like to also work on the present-day issues, for instance, the women's leave during a menstruation period, and also men allowing women to go for a leave because women are seen weak during this period. Of course, this is my personal interpretation. So body of women or women's sexuality is also considered as an element of anarchy. We can also see a male dominance perspective in Fiqh, where women and women's body are subordinated. They are not accepted as individuals, but women's body, women's sexuality are made available in the public sphere, are made available to the public, and these domains are not individualized, so to speak. Freud, in fact, talk about women and claims that in Western societies, the passive sexuality is considered as an enemy of civilization. However, along with this label, if you remember the pyramid I have just shown you, it gives some certain responsibility to male, so that male would have dominance over women, and through religious texts, this is legitimized somehow. Coming back to the law on wailing, it is possible to look into that from different perspectives. But I believe that if we are to look into that in a subtle manner, this is some sort of sanction on women that removes or strips women of her sexuality or suppresses sexuality of women. And we can see its reflections in the Islamic law too. So all these codes of attire imposed on women, we know that slaves are excluded from these laws. On the other hand, free women, provided that they cover their hair or other parts as required, then they will only be able to take part in the society. And at the same time, in Ottoman times, we know that many women had to dress as men in order to hide their identity. For instance, here, women are using some face masks to take part in the public sphere. So I just wanted to share this visual too. We have discussed a lot about the February 28 events. And our aim here is not to have our freedom only in terms of clothing, but in fact we are talking about such an extensive freedom that would allow self-determination for women. Indeed, the people who were victimized because they were wearing headscarves at that time, they were coded as alienated identities, others, so to speak. And indeed, trans individuals are experiencing the very same problems, so we cannot rule out the problems that they experience. So right now we are studying in parallel both the victims of headscarf women during the February 28 period, as well as the trans individuals and the grievances they had, particularly in working at some public authorities or receiving public services. So freedom is not one-sided, it's not a one-way street. We should also talk about freedom in an individual context, and I think this is very vital. In order to make best use of my time, I will be skipping those slides. Kasım Emin from Egypt, entitled Liberating Women. Is also available in Ottoman language. So this is one of the few books on this issue that is currently available. However, we also see that all these materials in the Ottoman language are not translated in present-day Turkish. Elmer Etul Cedide and Cedide's work, The New Women, have not been translated into present-day Turkish. However, Kasım's books, even though not translated, Mehmet Akif Ersoy responded to him, and Mehmet Akif Ersoy's book is entitled The Muslim Woman. Of course, we cannot know what was the reason for Mehmet Akif Ersoy to write this book or to come up with these arguments, but this is the only book available in Turkish. Tahrir Elmer Ercecide and its translation into Turkish would be very important, I believe. And freedom of religion is very important, but not only in terms of religion and faith. There is this initiative that you shall never walk alone. And women's self-determination in practicing their religion, manifesting their religious identity. So for young women or girls experiencing problems in that sphere, this platform is a venue for them to exchange their experience, act in solidarity. During the February 28 period, there was these chambers to convince people or to force people at that time. So we are now questioning similar issues as of today.
Also, if you could quickly wrap up, let's say 3 minutes, that would be great because we're at the end of the time. So within the family, the man covering the economic needs of the women and the children, therefore being the sort of the head of the household. And if the woman is disobedient, then there could be inflicted psychological and physical violence, and in a way sort of a legitimate violence by the man in a sort of a legal system. And again, reducing the reproductive function, the sexual functions of women, for example, female genital mutilation. This practice originates from ancient Egypt and some African tribes, as a matter of fact. However, in the religious discourse as well, woman is seen as an entity whose honor has to be kept, and therefore their sexuality is curbed through female genital mutilation. These are some of the ways how female genital mutilation takes place. As you can see, clitoridectomy, which means the taking away of the clitoris of the woman, and excision, and also infibulation, getting the outer layers and the inner layers of the vagina and the genital areas completely taken out. This is called the pharaoh's genital mutilation, as a matter of fact, where the labia minora and labia majora were all taken out, and therefore just allowing reproduction. In the COVID-19 period, the UNICEF units could not actively work, and they believe that 2.7 million female children were subjected to female genital mutilation in that time. I'm just going to go to the recommendations at the moment. So this organization of the Islamic law through male perspectives, I believe that on this issue, I believe that religious information has to be democratized, and this should be done through the agency of women as well. They need to have the necessary democratic environment so that they're going to voice their own opinions for the democratization of religious knowledge. The women have to stand against the lodges or other sects or cults that are infringing upon their freedoms, and this has to be supported politically as well. The institutions and their representation powers have to be supported politically, and it is very important that women have that kind of authority in trying to be able to do that. Sorry, I kept it a little bit longer. Thank you very much for this wonderful presentation. So theology, religion, and women, this nexus, you looked at it through a feminist perspective with the knowledge of theology as well. As somebody who has the necessary methodology and the knowledge about religion as well, and criticizing it that way, I think it can create such great work as we have seen here. And also the issue of faith or religion and women and how we can work on it. I think this is a very good example of how we can work on it. As you've said, in any condition, in any circumstance, women are made dependent, are made second class, and this can only be criticized through a feminist perspective and can be intervened that way. You have mentioned the male structures of Arabic, but if I could just add here, as you know, in Turkish, there is no male or female structure in Turkish, but still, as a culture, the Turkish culture is quite male-dominated. I mean, it sort of looks like in any sort of circumstance, women are faced with this kind of a ceiling. And also you've mentioned the forcible conviction to remove women's veils at some point. And now people are also talking about the fact that they have been forcibly put into veils in platforms like You Will Not Walk Alone. It'd be great if our political masters could hear about this at the moment, so that they could also understand how politics sort of rises on discussions about women, but then leave them alone, leave them lonely and stranded on their own. In the 28th of February period as well, women were made objects of these discussions, of this fight, but then the fruit of the fight was only eaten by the men. Thank you very much, therefore, for all the presentation. I'd just like to mention here that faculties of theology are very important, and Ankara University's Faculty of Theology is a very important place, I think, and having this kind of a work arise from that Faculty of Theology in Ankara University is not really surprising. It is a testament to the great work that they perform. So to the last presentation now.
I'm apologize, but please, can you pronounce your name? I don't want to make mistake.
It's pronounced De Obaldia.
Obaldia. Okay, let me call you as a Dr. Obaldia. Now, şimdiki sunuşumuz Dr. Obaldia.
Now the presentation is going to be by Dr. Obaldia.
Istanbul gem houses. Floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I shall just share my screen, if I may.
And you have 20 minutes.
Thank you. Can you see my slides?
Yes, we do.
And you can hear me, yes.
Exactly. Perfect.
All right, perfect. So I begin by thanking the Freedom of Beliefs Initiative, and in particular Dr. Mine Yildirim and Dr. Zehra Yilmaz for organizing this important international conference and for inviting me to present my latest research. I shall try to speak slowly for the benefit of the simultaneous translator. Many studies on Alevi women have revolved around the discourse of inherent equality between the genders in Alevism, whether from a concurring or a critical perspective. In this study, the principle of gender equality should be examined in relation to its factual and practical implementation in Alevi places of worship, known as gem houses or gemavi, and in the participatory roles within religion-related institutes. The gemavi should be taken as a model of gender equality in Turkey's Muslim community from two perspectives. Firstly, in terms of women's empowerment and participation at the administrative level, and secondly, in terms of access and ritual participation. Methodologically, this study is based on qualitative data obtained from interviews, notes, from casual conversation, as well as observations during field work carried out in the summer and winter of 2021 and the spring of 2022 at the following four Alevi places of worship, as you see on the screen in front of you. The Adalar Gemavi on Burgasada, the Kartal Gemavi in the district of Kartal, the Hazret Ali Gemavi in Sultan Ghazi, and the Kharaj Puja in Split. The majority of the publications that treat the issue of women's position in Alevism have been written from the perspective of theology or the philosophical equality variable practice. While very little research has been undertaken on the subject matter of this presentation, but the following three studies of importance should be mentioned, which you see on your screen. These are written by Jamal Salman, Nimet Oktan, and Demet by Kılıç Arslan. Quote, being an Alevi woman means enlightenment and freedom, unquote. And I just want to point out that all quotes on the presentation slides are from ladies who I interviewed within the Alevi community during my field work. So equality between men and women is a gender principle in Alevism, based on the theological rejection of Genesis in favor of the belief that the Creator created mankind as human beings and not particularly as men or women. Nonetheless, women hold a special place in Alevism, since they are considered to be the representatives of the Prophet Muhammad's daughter, Fatima, and wife of the fourth Caliph, Ali, who is held in high regard. In the Alevi religious belief system, the main structure of religious hierarchy was formed on the spiritual quality of the members rather than on their gender. Accordingly, everyone is equal before God, regardless of gender, and consequently, there is no segregation in ritual worship. This also transfers to participation within the administration of places of worship. Our study will now take us to four case studies of Gemavis in Istanbul. Quote, since we are born equal, in the Gem we are equal, in the Sema we are equal, On the street we are equal. The spiritual access, as well as the participation in rituals and religious festivals for both men and women at the small Adalar Cemevi located on one of the multi-faith isles in the Marmara Sea, shall be analyzed in comparative perspective with the extensive Kartal Cemevi situated in a Muslim-majority area of Istanbul, mainland. To begin, the Adalar Cemevi, also known colloquially as the Burgas Ada Cemevi, located on the island of Burgas, known in Turkish as Burgas Ada and in Greek as Antigone. It is the third largest of the Prince's Islands, situated in the northeast of the Sea of Marmara, near Istanbul. The Alevi revival of the 1980s, in which the moral and social Alevi identity was awakened in a diverse set of social movements, emphasizing public activism, along with the shift in demographics on the island in favor of the Alevis, resulted in the construction of a cemevi in 1996 on the site of an old coffee shop. It was later expanded into a complex measuring 1,384 square meters, comprising of a tea house, a garden, a kitchen, a classroom, a funerary place, and it was registered as a foundation under the name of Adalar Cumhuriyetçi Eğitim ve Kültür Vakfı. The cemevi was designed by an architect free of charge, and the plan is dodecagon, of a small size. Its design is conducive to gender equality, with one small front entrance accessed by both men and women, as well as one second entrance into the main hall. The seating in the form of cushioned chairs around the walls and cushions on floor is uniform, and there is no partition encouraging gender segregation. The open space, which is part of the cemevi complex, is a garden, which is combined with the seating area to serve the adjacent cafe. The tables and chairs are placed on the concrete path, running under a metal awning, as well as on the grass in no particular order. In practice, the space adheres to the planning norms laid down. Due to the pandemic, there were no gems taking place.
Obaldia, excuse me, there is a technical problem with your voice. Can you make it a little bit higher? Is it possible? Of course.
Okay. So in practice, the space adheres to the planning norms laid down. Due to the pandemic, there were no gems taking place, but I was able to attend a sohbet before Ashura during the months of Muharram. It was attended by more women than men. There was no obligation or mandatory requirement for the women to cover their hair within the cemevi hall or during some of the rituals, which preceded the sohbet. Rather, some chose to wear a head cover while others did not. The seating arrangement was also at the desire of the individual. Although there was unintended segregation, since all of the women chose to sit at the back wall facing the pulpit at which the dead was seated, since it provided a better view. Women participated actively within the ritual element by lighting 3 candles in honor of God, the Prophet, and Ali. At the end, a lokma consisting of a piece of cake and a peach was distributed in a clear plastic bag by the women who had cooked it, one of the on-site kitchens. During Ashura, the traditional dish was distributed at the cemevi, and people of both genders and all religious backgrounds attended and ate in the garden, sitting and chatting together without concern about gender segregation. The second case study is the Kartal Cemevi, which stands in stark contrast to the Burgas Ada Cemevi, both in terms of its location, its size, and scope. Situated in the heavily populated Muslim majority district of Kartal, The Çelebi was founded in 1993 under the legal status of an association, a dernek, called Kartal Çelebi Kültür Eğitim ve Sosyal Yardımlaşma Derneği. 3 years later, the association was closed and reopened as a foundation under the name of Kartal Çelebi Kültür Eğitim ve Sosyal Dayanışma Vakfı. The base construction area of the foundation is 2,000 square meters, and the total building usage area is 5,850 square meters. The striking Çelebi was designed by the architect Çınar, who was inspired by Seljuk architecture, and that of the dervish monasteries and shrines of Anatolia. There was no segregation at the Çelebi. There is equal access for both genders through one of the main doors, and the people sit wherever they wish, with women often sitting nearer the front because they arrive earlier. Within the Çelebi in particular, and the foundation more generally, men and women worship together, eat and work side by side without distinction or preference. And the practice of gender equality is instilled among children at a young age, with after-school and weekend courses offered in a mixed environment taught by female teachers. Both the Burgas Ada and the Kartal Çelebi were established out of necessity to fulfill the spiritual, ritual, and social needs of a Muslim minority community in the ever-changing demographics of a metropolis like Istanbul. In spite of their very different locations, the two places of worship have not been influenced by their multi-religious or their Sunni majority surroundings. On the contrary, they continue to adhere to strict norms of gender equality, which are inherent in the Alevi belief system, both architecturally and in terms of practical worship. Quote, qualities such as justice, sensitivity, and attention to detail make women excel as leaders, unquote. Historically, women have held the position of spiritual successor of a saint in dervish monasteries and are known to have numerous disciples in Anatolia. One of the most renowned examples of which was following the death of the Khorasanian mystic and philosopher Haji Bektash in his position of Academic Ana was placed. In contemporary Istanbul, Alevi women's roles continue to extend to ones of leadership in their houses of worship. As regards the above-mentioned Çelebis of Burgas Ada and Kartal, women also played important roles in their foundation, development, and today hold the positions of vice president, which has resulted in greater awareness about women's needs. They are now being addressed through administrative, educational, economic, and social means, such as the formation of women's branches, religious courses for women, provision of financial support through employment, and the recognition of Women's Day and Mother's Day with a variety of events. Furthermore, there are 4 Çelebis in Istanbul in which women have been elected the president. 2 of these shall be discussed in greater detail as follows. The Hazrat Ali Çelebi, located in the district of Sultan Gazi, which has a large immigrant and ethnic minority Sunni Muslim population, was established under the legal category of an association called Hazrat Ali İnanç Kültür Derneği. They had initially rented a space in another building, but were soon forced to move after the Sunni landlord opposed the presence of a Çelebi in the building. 6 months later, they relocated to the current site in still a Sunni majority working class neighborhood, where they are, however, not at risk of eviction because their landlord is Alevi. The director, Serpil Soylu, who is originally from Tokat, is a woman. When the Çelebi was first founded, Of the 7 members of the board of directors, 3 were women and 4 were men, in contrast to today, when women outnumbered the men at 4 to 3. Sir Bill Hannam, who was already active in the administration of the women's branch of the Genevieve, was encouraged by the previous 33-year-old Dede, spiritual social leader, to put herself forward for directorship because a man had preceded her. She expressed her opinions about the position to which a woman is rarely elected in a patriarchal society. Quote, "If it had have been a man in this position, he would not have advanced the Genevieve as much as I have. I think women are more disciplined and comprehensive. Men do not pay attention to detail. When I'm in the Genevieve, I address our society, the Turkish society, an Alevi woman who represents my Alevi society." Sirpal Hanum was elected in 2015 and has continued for 3 consecutive terms of a period of 3 years each, and she wishes to continue in the position. Under her leadership, there has been an emphasis on children and youth, who are encouraged to attend the Genevieve to be immersed in an Alevi environment where they can learn their religion and rites, to receive religious instruction and cultural formation during weekend courses, especially since they are influenced doctrinally by the Sunni-focused obligatory religious lessons in the Turkish state school curriculum. The youth can create their own identity through their contact with the Genevieve, engage with the information they receive, as well as openly express their Aleviness. Sirpal Hanum aims to organize scholarships for students who excel. There is also a special focus on women through the provision of Quran and exegesis courses on Friday, through financial support for those undergoing hardship, all under the umbrella of a female support network. She has also encouraged interdenominational relations by welcoming everyone in the neighborhood to the Genevieve, regardless of religious denomination, during religious festivals in which they come to eat and engage in conversation. Sirpal Hanum has not experienced opposition or negative reactions to her position as director from either her own community or the Sunni Muslim community. She openly appears on television, participates in conferences, and speaks at other events. Her husband has been her biggest support, as well as her friends who have remained a source.
More 4 minutes. You have more.
Okay, thank you. They have remained a source of encouragement for her. But her parents were reluctant for her to assume the position out of concern that she might have negative experiences as an Alevi woman. She concludes our interview with the affirmation of the above. Quote, "The most beautiful experiences were to form relations with the people around me. In the past, I didn't express myself very well. I feel more confident in articulating myself. I am no longer nervous. I've never had a bad experience. Since I do it voluntarily, it is not considered a chore," unquote. Moving swiftly on to our fourth and final case study, the Kharaj Puja. So this is situated in the ideal location on the eastern bank of the Golden Horn. The historically significant Ottoman-era Kharaj Dergah stands dwarfed by the modern urban development which has grown up around it. An association was established in 1960 to grant it legal status and a certain level of protection. I gathered with Husnia Takmas, who is the president of the Dergah, and with a group of women who were members of the women's branch or were employees at the Dergah. Following her election, Husnia Hanum played a vital role in increasing women's visibility and participation within the association, but also in winning legal cases that have enabled the building's renovation and opening to the public, as well as its use for religious purposes. Women's participation at the Dergah has not been restricted to administrative roles alone. Rather, they have been encouraged to explore their artistic abilities through music and literature, which has led to the publication of a poetry book to which many of the women present at the meeting contributed. The meeting ended with one of the ladies who had only recently been learning to play the lute, showing her impressive talent with emotive singing. So, there are exceptions, however. Quote, our Alevi community is under pressure, therefore women are under two loads of pressure. So in spite of the election of women to senior administrative positions within the Genoese, there remain an underlying effort to control women as a result of the patriarchal environment. This study will also addresses the erosion of Alevi gender principles within the urban setting due to the impact of snuffication and strict patriarchal norms upon Genoese founded in mixed Sunni Alevi neighborhoods in Istanbul, following the community's migration from rural Anatolia. This erosion can be demonstrated with different examples, as you see on your screen in front of you. Some of the names and the exact locations of these Genoese have been omitted upon request. So, for example, the lack of the active participation of Anas in ritual worship, the lack of female zakirs, segregation at two small Genoese located in a Sunni Muslim majority neighborhood, and the covering of the hair, which is sometimes encouraged, and also the greater need for the focus on the feminine aspect of Alevi belief. And this needs to be learned and interiorized by Alevi societies. So in conclusion, this can be summed up by one quote, which was, we now have the confidence to make our voices heard. And you see this represented in this beautiful photograph. So this study has demonstrated that despite the rare instances of gender inequality affected by a patriarchal society, Alevi places of worship in Istanbul have successfully adapted to the urban environment while maintaining in theory and practice norms of gender equality inherent in Alevi doctrine. This has enabled women to flourish in leadership positions and thus encouraging greater attendance and participation of girls, youth, and women within Genoese. Increased representation and visibility of Alevi women within the public sphere likewise reinforces egalitarian perceptions and practices in gender relations. I thank you very much for your attention. And I apologize for going over.
Thank you very much for this nice presentation to Dr. Obaldia. I would like to say some things, but I think I will prefer say to in Turkish. Alevi inancında biraz önce de aslında söylediğim gibi.
Alevism, in Alevi faith, in fact this holds true for all other faiths or religion, but since I'm most familiar to Alevism, I can fairly say that there is a clear difference between faith and practice, because the faith itself defines women as equal. However, in practice, it's not possible to talk about gender equality. In gem houses, particularly if you go to a gem house and if you listen to people, they do turn a blind eye to the reality, and they assert that men and women are equal. They claim that there are no men and women, there is only the Can. So they in fact build a shield from their faith around them. However, when we look into the community and the way community organizes itself, it is not really possible to talk about equality between men and women. It is not possible to talk about gender equality. Of course, there may be situations where Alevi women are in a better position as compared to other women in the society at large. For instance, Alevi women not covering their head may be seen as something as an advantage, but of course this is not really the only parameter, because Alevi women is faced with numerous inequalities or injustices that other Sunni women are not subjected to. Another note I would like to share is to draw your attention to the fact that the Alevi community is not uniform. There are faith-based divisions, there are other sorts of divisions too, and particularly in Turkey, they have been subjected to a severe assimilation policy. Therefore, the fact that there are women covering their head in Cemevi or Cem house is an outcome of an assimilation. So it is possible to interpret this in this way. Serpil Hanım's experience is rather an exception. I wish we could generalize this, but it is not really possible. When we look into the Alevi organizations in Turkey and in the diaspora, we can clearly see that women are not in decision-making processes, they're not in senior positions. We can clearly see that. But on the other hand, Ruveyda has referred to Kasım Emir. In this context, there is this concept of Can, human being. So the Alevi faith does not make these difference or distinction between men and women. So they are both beings, and the responsibility lies with beings only, so with all of them. So yes, due to this faith, there is this predisposition. However, considering the Prophet Muhammad's daughter Fatma, we cannot really see this type of equality in daily life, in society at all. So Alevi women still need a feminist approach, still need a feminist literature and analysis in order for us to better understand the Alevi women and their place in the society at large and their own communities. Thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation. I believe these are all my notes and takeaways. As far as I can see, there are questions. There are a couple of questions particularly addressed to Ruveyda, Çınar. Have you read the questions? I cannot see the questions right now. So let me very quickly read out the questions for you.
Şimdi Irak'taki yaklaşık yarım milyon Hristiyan çoğunluğunu Katolik Süryaniler bu şeye
500,000 Christians in Iraq are mostly made up of the Catholic Syriacs, in other words, Chaldeans. In Mosul, there are many Chaldeans living. Well, in fact, after the war, these demographics changed. I mean, my research is based on the data from 2015. Okay, let me first compile all the questions. Let me scroll back to see if I have missed anything.
Tarihselce okuma çerçevesinde İslam hukukunun kadın perspektifinden okunması tartışmalarının Türkiye'ye nasıl etkileri olduğunu
What are the implications in Turkey when it comes to the discussions about reading women's role in Islamic historiography? We need a renaissance in women's place in Islam, and how can we increase women's agency? How can we give or lend more voice to women? So these are questions to Ruveyda, Çınar.
What were some of the key factors impacting different roles women take in different Cemevis? Did I read? Cemevis, you studied. Vanessa, for Vanessa. Thank you so much for your interesting talk to Vanessa. Have you observed any influence of class differences among Cemevis concerning the issue of women's participants and activities? Alevi bir kadın olarak size sonuna kadar katılıyorum.
As an Alevi woman, I fully agree with you, Professor Bedriye Poyraz. Well, I wish I was mistaken myself.
Both Dr. Obaldia and Bedriye hocam, in what way and to what extent does the sufficiency of state and public share affect the gender politics with the Alevi communities and Cemevis? Thank you very much for presentation. They were all amazing. Biz Alevilerin yaşamlarında toplumsal örgütlenmelerinde kadınların yeterince yer alması da temel neden kadınların uzak durması ve
The reason why women are not included in organized Alevi communities is also to do with women holding themselves back. Well, I cannot agree more.
Have you observed any influence of class differences among the Cemevis concerning the issue of women's participation and activities from Kudret Nezir? I guess I read that question. Okay. Yezidiler bu durumun neresinde acaba?
What about the Yazidis? What about their situation? Okay, so these are the questions we have received. I hope you could follow the questions that were addressed to you. I believe we have already used all our time allocated to us, and the next session should be starting soon. So if you very quickly respond to the questions in the order of our panelists, we will start with Nurgül Hanım. You have 1 minute. Thank you. So the analysis I use are from Kilis, and these are based on the figures in 2015, and the figures, demographic figures changed after the war. However, in Syria, there was 877,000 Chaldeans in Syria. In fact, the Chaldeans originate from Nasturis. However, once they adopted Christianity, they've been called as Chaldeans since then. Birgül Açık Yıldız has a prominent research on this, so I strongly recommend her research because she indeed works on the Syriacs and Yazidis, and she also advocates that we should be working on them or analyzing them distinctively. Over to you, Ruveyda, Çınar, 1 minute. I have taken note of 2 questions about the historiography or historic interpretations of the Quran and perception of women. Yes, you have talked about the Ankara school of thought. This has already been beyond the traditional or standard way of thinking. Therefore, our theological faculty in Ankara is considered as an other by others. It is somewhat alienated. In fact, I'm a graduate of Selçuk University, but I'm now doing my PhD at Ankara University. So, according to the outside observations in terms of takfir, they consider that Ankara School of Thought is somewhat deviating from the standard Islam. I mean, for instance, if you come together with a traditional exegesis teacher, and if you claim that you want to do an historical interpretation or construing of the Quran, then in fact you become part of one school of thought. So if you would like to see more women in theological schools or in religious authorities, and if you claim that you can keep up to this challenge, then you can say, yes, I can do such sort of interpretation. But otherwise, unless otherwise, they would label you as takfir. And by the way, Ankara School of Thoughts Publishing House translates certain works of art, but they do not really receive a good acclamation from our audience. We need to look around the world and see how theological schools are perceived. Perhaps we need a bibliography for theological schools, for religious sociology, how religious sociology sees women under what circumstances, in which contexts. Perhaps we can compile a bibliography, we can do a context analysis or discourse analysis, just as Fatma Mernissi or Nazife Shishman in 1970s or 1980s. I could write my thesis, my dissertation, thanks to their translations. And we have Hidayet Şefkatli Tuksal. She is the only one who helped us with that. And we have Halve women's organizations and others who stand against the traditional religious authorities. So if you can wrap it up, I will be grateful. Thank you. So how can we make women have more voice, and how this can be ensured by the religious leaders? Given the circumstances of our society, I believe giving women more voice will only be possible through the women who work at the Presidency of Religious Affairs and other individuals who are familiar to feminism or who adopt feminism.
Yeah, thank you. I shall answer very briefly. Regarding the first question on the class difference, I didn't actually perceive anything regarding the impact of class differences. However, there's certainly an impact on the level of education and also the age of the individuals involved. And this was especially the case with the dedes. The younger the dede, the more encouraging he was for women to engage actively in positions of leadership, and also for anas to be present during ritual participation. Regarding the second question on the Sunnification, both on the part of the state and the public sphere, the impact, as I mentioned at the end of my, very briefly at the end of my presentation, I gave exceptions, and two of these included two very small Genovese located in Istanbul, in Sunni majority areas. They had separate entrances for men and women, and also there within the gem hall, the men and the women were required to segregate, to sit separately. There is also the issue of covering. Women are encouraged to cover in certain instances. Once again, this is the impact of the Sunnification, or shall I say, the Sunni majority environment in which these Genovese are constructed, following the migration of the Alevi communities to Istanbul. So definitely there is always a pressure. We see this in education as well, from the state perspective, from the state angle. Alevi children are required to take obligatory religious lessons in which there is no representation, proper representation of Alevi belief within the school curriculum for these particular religious lessons. So absolutely, there is an impact, and this is why the role of the Genovese in providing the students with an identity, an Alevi identity, and helping them to learn their Alevi beliefs are so vital. And you saw in some of the photos I took that the children are encouraged to practice within the ritual. and also a lot of female children were participating very actively. And in most cases, there are more women or more girls present in the rituals in the Genovese than the men or boys. So I also want to just emphasize very quickly before I finish that these, my presentation is not to suggest that there is complete equality in Alevism between men and women in practice, but through the examples I gave, we see that there is some efforts and some development in the role of women within the public sphere in a more kind of dominant role within leadership. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Obaldia. Bana bir soru var. Bana da bir soru var.
There is a question addressed to myself, so please allow me to respond to that very briefly. Concerning assimilation of women. Frankly speaking, this is not something I have dwelt upon. I have mostly thought of the assimilation of Alevis as a community. But now that you are asking, the GEM Foundation made a rule asking for women to cover their head while entering the GEM house. So the Alevi community is being subjected to assimilation altogether. So I don't think that this is especially targeting women per se. So thank you very much for these wonderful questions. We have gone beyond our schedule for a few minutes. I hope this can be tolerated. The next session was supposed to start at 2:40, and it is entitled Freedom of Religion or Belief and Gender Equality in the Education System. I would like to once again thank our panelists for their valuable presentations. Thank you very much. And we would like to also thank all the panelists